The granite headstones stretched across the hillside like an army, frozen mid-March, each white rectangle standing at perfect attention beneath a November sky the color of old steel. Fog clung to the grass in pale ribbons, wrapping itself around the markers, as if the dead themselves were exhaling their final breaths into the cold morning air. Jake Harrison stood among them at 8:47 a.m. on Veterans Day, his leather jacket doing nothing against the chill that had settled into his bones sometime around his 60th birthday and never quite left. 62 years old, he had outlived most of the men whose names were carved into these stones. The irony was not lost on him. Jake had spent 24 years in the United States Army, survived 3 tours in Afghanistan, and 1 in Iraq, taken a shrapnel to the back that still set off airport metal detectors, and somehow managed to keep breathing while better men stopped. The mathematics of survival had never made sense to him. Courage plus sacrifice should equal life, but the equation kept coming up wrong, leaving behind widows and fatherless children while cowards like him kept waking up each morning. He pulled a photograph from the inside pocket of his jacket, the edges soft from years of handling. The image showed a younger man in desert camouflage, his arm wrapped around a boy of 8 or 9, both of them grinning at the camera like the world held nothing but promise. Daniel Porter had possessed the kind of smile that made people trust him instantly, a slight asymmetry that pulled more to the right side as if even his joy couldn't quite contain itself within normal boundaries. The boy in his arms shared those same eyes, brown as autumn earth, though his smile was smaller, more cautious, the smile of a child who experienced the world through sight alone. Nearly a decade since that photograph had been taken. Almost 9 years since Daniel had shipped out to Afghanistan for what would become his final deployment. All that time since Jake had knelt in blood-soaked sand and made a promise he had spent every subsequent day breaking. His thumb traced the edge of the image, following the outline of the boy's face. Ethan would be 16 now, nearly a man. Jake tried to imagine what he looked like, whether the childhood softness had sharpened into angles, whether those cautious eyes had hardened against a world that had never learned to speak his language. The words came out as vapor in the frozen air, barely audible even to himself. "I'm sorry, Danny. Still haven't kept my word." A car passed on the road beyond the cemetery gates, its headlights cutting briefly through the fog before disappearing. Jake remained motionless, a statue among statues, until the first pale fingers of dawn began to claw at the eastern horizon. Only then did he fold the photograph back into his pocket and turn away from the rows of white stones, his boots leaving dark prints in the frost-covered grass. The clubhouse sat in an industrial district on Pittsburgh's eastern edge, a converted warehouse that still bore the faded ghost of Morrison steel fabrication on its brick facade. Inside, the space had been transformed over 15 years into something between a bar and a shrine, with pool tables occupying the center floor, a self-service counter running along one wall, and photographs covering every available vertical surface. Black and white images, mostly some in color, all showing men and women in various stages of military service or motorcycle brotherhood. Red ribbons marked the ones who had passed. There were a lot of red ribbons. Iron Brotherhood had never been a gang, despite what nervous suburbanites assumed when they saw 40 leather-clad riders thundering down the highway. The club existed as a refuge for veterans who had returned from war to find that civilian America had no idea what to do with them. Men and women who had witnessed horrors, committed necessary violence, lost pieces of themselves in desert sand or jungle mud, only to come home to a society that thanked them for their service, with the same hollow politeness reserved for holding doors open for strangers. 23 members had gathered by 9 o'clock that morning, preparing for the annual Veterans Day parade through downtown Pittsburgh. Jake sat alone at the far end of the bar, his third cup of coffee growing cold in front of him when the text message arrived. The phone buzzed against the scarred wood. A link appeared in the club's group chat, sent by one of the younger members with a message that read simply, "Brothers, look at this. Disgusting." Jake's thumb hovered over the screen. He had seen enough cruelty in 62 years to last several lifetimes. Whatever waited behind that link would only add to the weight he already carried. But something compelled him to tap the video anyway, some instinct honed by decades of walking toward danger instead of away from it. The image quality was poor, shot on a phone in failing evening light. A teenager sat on a bench outside what appeared to be a small-town diner, a paper bag clutched in his hands. He seemed peaceful for a moment, unaware of the shadows approaching from behind. Then the shadows resolved into three larger figures, and the violence began. Jake watched the bag get snatched away, watched the seated boy's hands rise in frantic gestures that the attackers mimicked with exaggerated mockery. He watched food hit the ground and get stomped into paste. He watched a child cry in absolute silence while laughter echoed from the phone's tinny speaker. The camera zoomed in on the victim's face. The coffee mug slipped from Jake's fingers and shattered against the floor, but he didn't hear it. He was years in the past kneeling in an Afghan field hospital watching a man die in his arms. He was holding a creased photograph while blood pooled beneath his knees. He was making a promise he would spend nearly a decade failing to keep. The boy in the video had Daniel Porter's eyes, Daniel Porter's jawline, that same cautious, guarded expression that came from navigating a world of silence. Ethan, Daniel's son, the child Jake had sworn to protect. A hand landed on his shoulder, heavy and warm. Tom Callahan stood behind him, 77 years of hard living, carved into every line of his face. They called him Preacher within the club, a holdover from his 30 years as an Army chaplain. He had ministered to dying soldiers in Vietnam, held communion services in the mud of the Mekong Delta, blessed bodies in Kuwait and Iraq and Afghanistan. His hair had gone white as communion wafers, and his eyes held the particular distance of a man who had spoken to God on behalf of thousands and wasn't entirely certain God had been listening. Titan, the old chaplain's voice carried the resonance of decades spent projecting over helicopter rotors and artillery fire. What's wrong? Jake couldn't form words. He simply turned the phone screen toward Preacher and let the video speak for itself. The old man watched in silence. Then he called for Maria Santos, who went by Doc, and she called for Walt Morrison, who went by Grizzly. And within 15 minutes, the entire leadership of Iron Brotherhood stood clustered around Jake's phone, watching a 16-year-old boy get tormented while 200,000 strangers laughed. Doc had been one of the first female combat surgeons in the Army, a Puerto Rican woman from the Bronx who had learned to cut and stitch under fire before most of the club's younger members had been born. Her hands bore a slight tremor now, the ghost of too many 20-hour surgery sessions in field hospitals where the wounded arrived faster than she could save them. She had been present at the aid station in Kandahar the day Daniel Porter died. She had been the one to officially pronounce him gone. Grizzly looked exactly like his nickname suggested, 6'4" and 240 pounds of aging muscle and scarred tissue. He had spent 28 years as a career soldier, rising to sergeant major before his son Kevin got killed by an IED in Fallujah, and something inside him simply stopped working. He rarely spoke anymore. The words seemed to have died alongside his boy. The last to arrive was Jimmy Whitehorse, a Navajo from the Arizona reservation, who had served as a sniper with more than 100 confirmed kills. They called him Ghost because of how he moved through the world, now present, but not quite real. A man who slept under bridges and in forests because the nightmares wouldn't let him rest indoors. His PTSD was the worst in the club, bad enough that he couldn't hold a job or maintain an apartment, but Iron Brotherhood kept him fed and clothed and gave him a reason to keep existing. Ghost rarely spoke, but when the video ended, his voice cut through the silence like a blade. "Who is he to you, Titan?" Jake looked at the frozen image on his screen, at the tear-streaked face of a boy he had abandoned. "His father died so I could live." The words hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. Around him, the other members exchanged glances, heavy with understanding. They had all lost brothers in combat. They all knew the weight of survival. "Tell us," Preacher said quietly. So Jake told them. Kandahar province, Afghanistan, almost 9 years earlier. Temperature hovering around 118 degrees. A convoy of 4 MRAPs moving along Route Tampa, the main supply road that coalition forces had nicknamed IED. Alley, for reasons that required no explanation. Jake had been 54 years old, a master sergeant with more combat experience than most of the kids in his unit, had years of life. He rode in the second vehicle handling communications with base while keeping one eye on the terrain scrolling past the armored windows. Daniel Porter occupied the seat across from him, a sergeant first class from Special Forces who had been attached to their unit for a joint operation. 35 years old, young enough to be Jake's son, if Jake had ever managed to maintain a relationship long enough to produce children. Daniel possessed an easy competence that Jake had rarely encountered in 2 decades of military service. The kind of soldier who could defuse a tense situation with a joke or put a bullet through a target's eye at 300 meters, depending on what the moment required. They had been talking about families. Daniel had produced the photograph from his vest pocket, the one showing him and Ethan, and his voice had softened in a way that combat veterans rarely allowed themselves. He's 8 now. Can't hear a thing, been that way since birth. Doctors say there's nothing they can do. The asymmetric smile had appeared pulling right. But you know what he doesn't know? The world has sound, so he doesn't miss it. He only gets sad when people treat him like he's missing something. Must be hard, Jake had offered inadequately. Harder for everyone else than for him. Kid's the strongest person I know. Sees things other people miss because he's not distracted by all the noise. Daniel had tucked the photo away. I promised him I'd teach him to ride a bike when I get back. He's scared of falling, but I told him I'd be there to catch him. The convoy had continued rolling through the shimmering heat. Jake had been about to ask another question when the world exploded. The lead vehicle caught the IED directly flipping onto its side in a ball of fire and twisted metal. Then the gunfire started from both flanks, and Jake realized they had driven directly into an L-shaped ambush, the Taliban's signature move. He remembered scrambling for cover, remembered returning fire, remembered screaming coordinates into his radio while rounds snapped past his head, remembered Daniel shouting a warning, something about incoming mortars, and then remembered nothing but darkness and pain and a terrible crushing weight pressing down on his chest. When consciousness returned, he was lying on his back in the dust, and Daniel Porter was sprawled on top of him. The younger man's body had absorbed the shrapnel meant for Jake. His back looked like something from a nightmare shredded by metal fragments that had turned his vest into confetti. Somehow impossibly, Daniel was still alive, still conscious. His hands had found Jake's collar and were gripping with the desperate strength of a man who knew he was dying but refused to go quietly. Tighten. Blood bubbled at the corners of his mouth. Listen to me. Medic's coming, Danny. Hold on. Ethan. The name emerged as a wet gasp. My boy. He can't hear. The world doesn't understand him. You're going to teach him to ride that bike yourself. Promise me. The grip tightened. Promise you'll look after him, be there for him, like I was there for you today. Jake had been crying, though he hadn't realized it until he felt the tears cutting channels through the dust and blood on his face. I promise, Danny, I swear. The asymmetric smile had appeared one final time, weaker than before, but still unmistakably Daniel's. Tell him his dad loves him. Always. Then the grip loosened and the light went out of those brown eyes, and Jake had been left holding the body of a man who had traded his life for Jake's without a moment's hesitation. Doc had arrived 3 minutes later. She had checked for a pulse, looked into Daniel's empty eyes, and spoken the words that still haunted Jake's nightmares. Titan, I'm sorry, he's gone. The story emptied out of Jake like poison from a wound, leaving him hollowed and trembling in the clubhouse's dim light. The other members had gathered closer as he spoke, their faces wearing expressions of recognition. They had all known loss like this. They all carried their own ghosts. Grizzly broke his characteristic silence. So you made a promise to a dying man. And then what? Jake stared at his hands, at the scars that crisscrossed his knuckles from decades of violence and hard labor. Then I came home, tried to drink myself to death for a while, moved to Pittsburgh because it was far enough from Ohio that I could pretend Danny's family didn't exist. His voice cracked. I sent Christmas cards the first few years, made a couple phone calls. Then I just stopped. Told myself they'd moved on, that they didn't need some broken-down old soldier making their grief worse. And the boy, Ghost's dark eyes, held no judgment. What happened to him? That. Jake gestured at the phone still clutched in Preacher's weathered hand. That's what happened to him. 16 years old, can't hear, and the whole world is laughing while he cries. The silence that followed felt like a held breath, the club waiting to see what would emerge on the exhale. Then Doc stepped forward, her surgeon's hand steady despite the tremor that plagued her idle moments. I was there, Titan. In Kandahar. I was the one who pronounced Daniel dead. Her voice caught, then steadied. And I've spent years wondering if there was something I could have done differently, some way I could have saved him. There wasn't. But this, she pointed at the phone, this we can do something about. Preacher nodded slowly, his pale eyes distant with memory. In Vietnam, there was a chaplain who stayed with my unit during a 3-day siege. He had no weapon, no way to defend himself, but he never left our side. I asked him once if he was afraid to die. He told me he was terrified, but he said being afraid to stand with his men was worse than being afraid to die. What happened to him? Jake asked. Mortar took out our bunker on day 4. He threw himself over 2 privates and absorbed the blast. Preacher's jaw tightened. Those 2 boys lived. One became a doctor, saved hundreds of lives over his career. The other one is standing here right now. Grizzly rose from his seat, his massive frame seeming to fill the entire room. My boy Kevin died at 22, Fallujah. I haven't visited his grave since the funeral. The words came out rusty like machinery long unused. I told myself it would hurt too much. But the truth is I was running. Same as you, Titan. Same as all of us. Ghost had moved to the window, his silhouette dark against the gray morning light. In my people's tradition, spirits of the dead cannot rest if promises made to them remain broken. They wander between worlds waiting. He turned back to face the room. Daniel Porter is waiting, Titan. He's been waiting for you to keep your word. Jake looked around at these men and women who had become his family in the absence of any other. They had all served. They had all suffered. They had all found each other in the wreckage of lives that civilian America couldn't begin to understand. What are you suggesting? He asked, though he already knew. Preacher stepped forward, and for the first time in months, something like purpose burned in his faded blue eyes. How far is Millbrook, Ohio? 3 hours, maybe 3.5. Then we have 3 hours to make a plan. The old chaplain looked around the room. Who rides with Titan? Every hand went up, 23 leather-clad arms rising in unison, a forest of solidarity. Doc was already pulling out her phone. I'll contact the chapters in Ohio and West Virginia. We need numbers. How many? Jake asked. Enough that no one in that town ever forgets. Grizzly's voice had lost its rust, sharpening into something that sounded almost like hope. Enough to show that boy he's not alone. Within 3 hours, the responses began flooding in. 20 members from the Cleveland chapter, 15 from Columbus, another 12 from West Virginia. By evening, 47 riders had confirmed their attendance for a gathering in Millbrook, Ohio, scheduled for Saturday, 3 days hence. The message had been simple. Ride for respect, for a fallen soldier's son. No violence, no threats, just presence. Just standing beside a child the world had abandoned. Jake sat alone in his motel room that night, the dog tags he had taken from Daniel's body years ago pressed against his palm. The metal was warm from his skin, the engraved letters worn smooth by years of handling. Porter Daniel J. Blood type, service number, religious preference. Everything a dead man needed for identification and nothing of what had made him alive. He should have given these to Rachel at the funeral. Should have pressed them into her palm and offered whatever comfort a widow could accept from the man who had survived while her husband died. Instead, he had kept them telling himself he was honoring Daniel's memory, when really he was just clinging to his own guilt like a drowning man clutching an anchor. Tomorrow he would drive to Millbrook. He would face Rachel Porter and whatever accusation she chose to level at him. He would look into the eyes of the boy he had failed and try to explain why it had taken so long and a viral video of suffering to finally honor a promise made in blood and dust. He didn't expect forgiveness. He wasn't sure he deserved it. But maybe at 62 years old he could finally stop running. Millbrook, Ohio had died the same slow death as 1,000 other Rust Belt towns strangled by economics and abandoned by progress. The steel mill that had once employed half the population had closed in 2008, and the community had been bleeding residents ever since. Empty storefronts lined Main Street, their windows soaped over or simply dark. Houses stood vacant on every block, their lawns overgrown, and their porches sagging with neglect. The population had dropped from 15,000 to just over 8,000. Those who remained were mostly the elderly and the stubborn, people with roots too deep to transplant and nowhere else to go. The only source of civic pride left was the high school football team, which had somehow managed to win the state championship 2 years running, giving the town something to celebrate while everything else crumbled. Jake arrived on Thursday afternoon, 2 days before the main event, with 5 other riders forming an advance team. Preacher rode beside him, his white hair streaming beneath his helmet like a battle flag. Doc followed close behind, then Grizzly, then Ghost, and finally a young Marine named Marcus, who went by Maverick and had driven through the night from Charleston because he couldn't stand the thought of a veteran's kid suffering alone. The Porterhouse sat on the eastern edge of town, a ranch-style structure that had probably looked cheerful in the 1970s, but now sagged with decades of deferred maintenance. Paint peeled from the siding in long strips. The lawn had surrendered to weeds months ago. A rusted basketball hoop tilted drunkenly over the cracked driveway, its net long since rotted away. Jake parked his bike at the curb and sat for a moment studying the house where Daniel's family had spent years struggling without him. A faded sticker clung to the rear window of an aging Toyota in the driveway, Army Wife. The letters had bleached almost to invisibility, ghosts of pride from a time when that identity had meant something other than widow. "You want us to wait out here?" Preacher asked. "Yeah, this part I need to do alone." The walk to the front door felt like the longest march of Jake's life, longer than any patrol through Taliban territory, longer than the endless corridors of VA hospitals. His boots seemed to weigh 100 pounds each. His heart hammered against his ribs like it was trying to escape. He raised his fist and knocked. The woman who opened the door had aged more than the years since he had last seen her. Rachel Porter had been in her mid-30s at Daniel's funeral, her beauty dimmed by grief but still evident. Now she was 44, and the intervening time had carved deep lines around her eyes and mouth. Her dark hair had gone heavily gray at the temples. She wore hospital scrubs beneath a thin cardigan, the uniform of someone who had just finished or was about to start a 12-hour shift. Recognition flickered across her features, followed immediately by something harder. Titan. Rachel. All this time. The words landed like stones dropped into still water. You show up after all this time. I know, I have no excuse. You promised him. Her voice didn't rise, didn't crack, didn't waver. That made it worse. You knelt beside him and promised you would look after us, that you would be there for Ethan. And then you vanished. Jake stood on her doorstep and absorbed the accusation without defense. There was nothing he could say that would undo years of absence. No explanation that would justify his failure. I was a coward, he said finally. I was so busy feeling guilty about surviving that I couldn't face the people Danny died for. I told myself you'd moved on, that you didn't need me dragging my grief into your lives. But the truth is I was running. Running from you. Running from Ethan. Running from the promise I made. Rachel stared at him for a long moment. Then something in her face shifted the anger, giving way to an exhaustion so profound it seemed to emanate from her bones. I'm tired, Titan. So tired I can barely stand up most days. Working double shifts just to keep the lights on. Coming home to a son who won't leave his room because the whole world saw him crying. Getting death threats from strangers because I dared to defend my own child online. Her eyes glistened, but no tears fell. I've been fighting alone for so long. And you show up now, after all this time, because you saw a video. Yes, he wouldn't insult her with justifications. I saw the video, I saw what they did to Danny's son, and I realized I'd broken my promise long enough. Behind Rachel, Jake caught a glimpse of the living room of framed photographs on the walls showing a smiling man in a uniform of a teenage boy's shoes kicked carelessly beside a worn couch. The evidence of lives continuing in the absence of the man who should have been there to live them. What exactly are you planning to do? Rachel asked. Saturday, 40 riders are coming to Millbrook. We're going to parade through town and stop at the place where Ethan was attacked. We're going to stand there, all of us in silence. And we're going to show your son that his father's brothers haven't forgotten him. And you think that will help? A bunch of bikers roaring through town? We won't roar. We'll ride slowly, quietly. We'll carry American flags and POW banners. And when we stop, we won't say a word. We'll just be there. Jake met her eyes. Because Ethan lives in silence, Rachel. He doesn't hear the cruel words or the mocking laughter. But he sees. And what we want him to see is 40 people who came from across 3 states just to stand beside him. Rachel was quiet for a long time. Behind her, somewhere in the house, a floorboard creaked. Jake imagined Ethan listening from the hallway, trying to figure out who was at the door and why his mother sounded so strained. Daniel used to write about you, Rachel said finally, in every letter, every email. He said you were the best soldier he'd ever served with. Said if anything ever happened to him, you were the one person he trusted to look after us. She drew a shaky breath. I believed him. Even after you disappeared, I kept telling myself you'd come back eventually, that you just needed time. I needed more than time. I needed to stop being a coward. And now I'm here, late but here, and I'm not leaving again. Rachel stepped aside, opening the door wider. Then you'd better come in. There's someone you need to meet. The hallway was narrow-lined with more photographs. Jake's eyes caught glimpses of Daniel at various ages and in various uniforms of Rachel, in a wedding dress of Ethan growing from infant to toddler to child. The most recent photos showed a teenage boy with his father's angular features and his mother's cautious eyes, a young man caught between childhood and adulthood. Rachel led him to a closed door at the end of the hall. She knocked twice and opened it without waiting for a response. The room was small, cluttered with the debris of adolescent life. Posters covered the walls, mostly artwork prints rather than rock bands or athletes. A desk sat beneath his window, buried under sketchbooks and pencils. And on the bed, cross-legged with a drawing pad in his lap, sat Ethan Porter, 16 years old. Daniel's jawline, Daniel's eyes. That same cautious expression that Jake remembered from the photograph carried through Afghan dust. The boy looked up at the intrusion, his gaze moving from his mother to the stranger filling the doorway. Something flickered across his features, recognition or memory, or perhaps just curiosity. Rachel began moving her hands, forming shapes that Jake recognized as sign language, even though he couldn't interpret them. Ethan watched her fingers intently, then looked at Jake with renewed interest. The boy rose from the bed and crossed the room, stopping a few feet from Jake. He studied the older man's face with an intensity that felt almost physical, as if he were reading something written in the lines and scars. Then Ethan's hands began to move and Rachel translated in a voice thick with emotion. He says he knows who you are. His father wrote about you in letters. Jake nodded, forgetting for a moment that verbal acknowledgement meant nothing to a deaf boy. Ethan continued, signing his movements quick and fluid. Rachel translated, he says he waited for you. After the funeral, he kept asking when Uncle Titan was coming. I told him you would come when you were ready. A pause. He says it took you a long time to be ready. The words hit Jake like a physical blow. This boy had spent years, waiting years, wondering why the man his father trusted had never appeared. And now here Jake stood, old and weathered, and far too late, with nothing to offer except inadequate apologies. He sank to one knee, bringing his eyes level with Ethan's. The motion hurt his old wounds, protesting the position, but he ignored the pain. He reached into his jacket and withdrew the dog tags, the ones he had carried against his heart for nearly a decade. The metal caught the light from Ethan's window, the engraved letters briefly legible. Porter Daniel J. Jake held them out, and Ethan's eyes went wide. These belong to your father, Jake said, speaking slowly and clearly so the boy could read his lips. He was wearing them the day he saved my life. I've carried them for years, waiting until I was brave enough to bring them to you. Ethan's hands trembled as he reached for the tags. He cradled them against his chest, his head bowed, his shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Jake remained on his knee, watching this boy grieve fresh wounds that should have scarred over years ago. He had done this. His cowardice, his absence, had left this child without even the small comfort of his father's final possession. Then Ethan did something unexpected. He stepped forward and wrapped his arms around Jake's neck, pulling the older man into a fierce embrace. The dog tags pressed between them, metal warmed by the boy's hands. No words, no signs, just two people holding on to each other in the wreckage of shared loss. Rachel stood in the doorway, tears streaming down her face. And Jake, for the first time in years, allowed himself to believe that maybe it wasn't too late after all. That night, the message went out across social media channels, spreading through veteran networks and motorcycle clubs and communities of people who had never met Ethan Porter, but recognized his pain. Iron Brotherhood rides. Saturday, Millbrook, Ohio, for a fallen hero's son. No violence, no threats, just presence. By Friday morning, 47 riders had become 60. By Friday evening, the number had climbed to 80. Veterans from Vietnam to Afghanistan. Mothers who had lost sons to war. Fathers who understood what it meant to fail the people who depended on you. The town of Millbrook watched these developments with growing unease. The local Facebook page exploded with speculation and fear. Rumors spread about biker gangs coming to exact revenge, about violence planned against the Brennan family whose son had filmed the attack. The police chief called an emergency meeting. News vans from Columbus and Cleveland arrived to set up camp. And somewhere in town, in a grand house on the wealthy side of the tracks, Judge Robert Brennan placed a call to the state police requesting additional protection for his family, still convinced that his son's cruel video could be spun into a story of persecution rather than consequence. The stage was set. The players had assembled, and a town that had spent years slowly dying was about to learn something about what it meant to truly live. Saturday would change everything. But first, there was one more night to endure, one more stretch of darkness before the dawn. Jake sat in his motel room, the dog tags now around Ethan's neck where they belonged, and allowed himself to feel something he had almost forgotten existed. Hope. The motel squatted beside Route 30 like a relic from a forgotten America, its neon sign flickering between vacancy and darkness in an irregular rhythm that suggested electrical failure rather than intention. 20 rooms stretched along a single concrete walkway, their doors painted a shade of green that might have been cheerful in 1974, but now simply looked tired. The parking lot had transformed into a forest of chrome and leather, 43 motorcycles arranged in neat rows like soldiers awaiting inspection. Friday night settled over Millbrook with the weight of held breath. Inside room 7, Jake Harrison sat on the edge of a mattress that sagged in the middle from decades of temporary occupants, his hands clasped between his knees, his eyes fixed on nothing. The meeting with Ethan had hollowed something out of him, carved away a blockage he hadn't realized existed until it was gone. For years, he had carried the weight of broken promises like stones in his pockets, and now that he had finally set one down, he felt strangely weightless. A knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. Preacher entered without waiting for invitation, 2 cans of cheap beer in his weathered hands. The old chaplain moved with the careful economy of a man whose joints had begun to betray him, lowering himself into the room's single chair with a grunt of discomfort. Figured you could use company. He held out one of the cans, or at least something to do with your hands. Jake accepted the beer but didn't open it. Can't sleep, keep thinking about tomorrow. That's because tomorrow matters. Preacher cracked his own can and took a long swallow. Been a while since anything mattered enough to keep you up, hasn't it? The question landed with uncomfortable accuracy. Jake had spent years perfecting the art of not caring, of maintaining enough emotional distance from the world that nothing could hurt him. The strategy had worked more or less. It had also left him hollow. 24 years in the Army, Jake said slowly. 3 combat tours, hundreds of missions. And somehow this feels bigger than any of them. Because this time you're not fighting an enemy, you're fighting yourself. Preacher's pale eyes caught the dim light from the bedside lamp. That's always the harder battle. Jake turned the unopened beer can in his hands, feeling the condensation slick against his palms. What if it doesn't work? What if we ride in there tomorrow and nothing changes? What if Ethan looks at us and just sees a bunch of old men playing dress-up? Then at least he'll know we tried. Preacher leaned back in the chair, his white hair catching shadows. Let me tell you something about standing with people Titan. Back in '68, during the siege at Khe Sanh, there was a chaplain attached to our unit. Father McCarthy, Irish as they come, couldn't have weighed more than 140 pounds soaking wet. We were surrounded for 77 days, taking fire around the clock, watching friends die every single day. And this little priest never left our side. Was he armed? Not even a knife. Said it would compromise his ministry. A ghost of a smile crossed Preacher's lined face. We thought he was crazy at first. What good is a man who can't fight? But every night he'd move through the trenches, talking to the boys, praying with the ones who wanted it, just sitting with the ones who didn't. He couldn't stop the bullets or the mortars. All he could do was be there. Jake finally opened his beer more for something to do than from any desire to drink. What happened to him? Day 73, a mortar round landed in the aid station. Father McCarthy was inside giving last rites to a kid who had caught shrapnel that morning. When he heard the whistle, he threw himself over 2 wounded Marines, covered them with his body. Preacher's voice had gone quiet, each word carrying weight. The blast killed him instantly. But those 2 boys lived. And you knew them. I was one of them. The old chaplain finished his beer and set the empty can on the floor beside his chair. Point is, Titans, sometimes the bravest thing you can do is just show up. Father McCarthy couldn't stop the war. He couldn't save everyone. But he could be present, and that presence saved lives. Tomorrow we can't undo what happened to Ethan. We can't bring his father back. But we can stand beside him, and maybe that'll be enough. The silence that followed felt different from the silences Jake had grown accustomed to over the years. This one held something warm in it, something almost like absolution. "How do you still believe?" Jake asked. "After everything you've seen, all the death, all the suffering, how do you still have faith?" Preacher considered the question for a long moment. "I don't believe the same way I used to. Vietnam burned the simple faith right out of me, but I've seen enough to know there's something bigger than us at work in the world. Call it God, call it the universe, call it whatever you want. Something brings people together when they need each other most. Something led you to that video. Something brought us all here." He rose from the chair, his knees popping audibly. "Get some sleep, Titan. Tomorrow's going to be a long day." After Preacher left, Jake sat alone with his thoughts until the silence became unbearable. He pulled on his jacket and stepped out onto the concrete walkway, needing air that didn't taste like stale motel. The parking lot was not as empty as he expected. A figure sat on one of the motorcycles at the far end, silhouetted against the glow of a distant streetlight. Jake recognized the stillness even before he made out the features. Ghost rarely slept indoors, but apparently he had found a compromise in the parking lot. Jake approached slowly, deliberately making noise with his boots so he wouldn't startle a man whose reflexes had been honed by years of eliminating targets from distances most people couldn't even see. "Mine company?" Jake asked. Ghost shifted slightly, making room on the bike's buddy seat. "Couldn't sleep either. Seems to be going around." They sat together in the darkness, two old soldiers watching the stars wheel slowly overhead. The motel's failing neon sign buzzed and flickered, throwing intermittent green light across the chrome forest of motorcycles. "The boy," Ghost said finally, "the one who can't hear. You think he suffers?" Jake considered the question. "He's been through hell. The bullying, the isolation, losing his father." "That's not what I mean." Ghost's voice carried the particular flatness of a man who had learned to disconnect his words from his emotions. "In my culture, we don't have a word for disability. The Navajo believe that every person is born with a gift, something only they can bring to the community. Someone who can't hear experiences the world differently than those who can. They notice things we miss because we're distracted by sound." "His drawings are incredible," Jake admitted. "Rachel showed me some of his sketchbooks. The kid sees details I would have walked right past. Because he looks while the rest of us are busy listening." Ghost turned his dark eyes toward Jake. "Tomorrow when we stand in silence, we'll be entering his world. Just for a moment, we'll know what it feels like to exist without sound. And in that moment, maybe he'll understand that we see him. Really see him." The words settled into Jake's consciousness like stones dropping into deep water. He had been thinking about the ride as a show of force, a demonstration of numbers meant to intimidate those who had hurt Ethan. But Ghost was suggesting something different, something more profound. "Among my people," Ghost continued, "we believe the spirits of the dead remain restless until the promises made to them are fulfilled. They wander between worlds, unable to find peace." He looked up at the stars. "Daniel Porter has been wandering for years, Titan. Tomorrow you finally set him free." Before Jake could respond, another figure emerged from one of the motel rooms. Grizzly moved across the parking lot with the heavy tread of a man carrying invisible weight, his massive frame somehow diminished by the darkness. "Room felt too small," the big man rumbled as he approached. Walls kept closing in. Ghost shifted again, and Grizzly settled onto an adjacent motorcycle, the suspension groaning under his bulk. Three veterans sat in silence, watching the night slowly surrender to approaching dawn. "Can I tell you something?" Grizzly's voice emerged rough with disuse. "Something I've never told anyone in the club." "We're listening," Jake said. "When Kevin died, his funeral was at Arlington. Full military honors, flag-draped coffin rifle salute, the whole thing. I stood there like a statue watching them fold that flag and hand it to Kevin's mother, and I felt nothing. Absolutely nothing, like someone had reached into my chest and scooped out everything that made me human." Neither Jake nor Ghost spoke. Some stories needed to emerge on their own schedule. There was an old man at the service. Stood in the back, didn't talk to anyone, just watched. I didn't recognize him, figured he was some veteran who made a habit of attending military funerals. We get those sometimes guys who feel like they need to bear witness. Grizzly paused, his massive hands gripping the motorcycle's handlebars. After the service, everyone else left, but this old guy walked up to me. He was wearing a Vietnam veteran cap, must have been in his 70s. He just looked at me for a long moment, and then he said something I've never forgotten. Jake waited. He said, "I don't know your son, but I know your pain. My boy died in '69 Quang Tri province. I've spent 40 years looking for a reason to keep going, and the only one I've found is standing beside other fathers who are feeling what I felt." Grizzly's voice cracked slightly. Then he handed me a card with his phone number and said to call if I ever needed to talk. Said the only way through the grief was through it, and no one should have to walk that path alone. Did you call him? No, I was too proud, too stubborn, too broken. Put the card in my wallet and left it there. Grizzly reached into his back pocket and produced a worn leather billfold. From inside, he withdrew a small rectangle of paper creased and faded with age. Carried it for 17 years, never called. What happened to him? Died 3 years ago. His daughter tracked me down somehow, sent me a letter he'd written before he passed. He'd left instructions for her to contact all the fathers he'd met at military funerals over the years, dozens of us all carrying the same card in our wallets, all too scared to reach out. Grizzly stared at the card in his hands. The letter said he understood, said he knew most of us would never call and that was okay. Said the important thing wasn't whether we talked, it was knowing we weren't alone, knowing that somewhere out there someone understood. He tucked the card back into his wallet. I think about that old man every day. And tomorrow when we ride into that town, I'm going to be him for Ethan. I'm going to be the stranger who shows up just to say, I see your pain. You're not alone. The night seemed to deepen around them, the stars brightening as the last traces of twilight faded. Three men who had seen the worst of humanity sat together in the darkness, finding unexpected solace in shared confession. Ghost spoke again, his voice barely above a whisper. Among my people, we say that grief shared is grief halved. But we also say that standing with someone in their grief, even a stranger, creates a bond that death cannot break. He looked at Jake. Tomorrow we become family with that boy, not by blood but by choice. And chosen family is the strongest kind. The hours before dawn passed in quiet conversation and longer silences. Doc joined them sometime around 4, her surgeon's hands wrapped around a cup of gas station coffee, and listened to the three men talk about loss and redemption and the strange paths that had brought them to this parking lot in rural Ohio. When the sky began to lighten in the east, Doc cleared her throat. There's something I need to tell you, Titan. Something I should have told you years ago. Jake turned to face her. What is it? That day in Kandahar, when I reached Daniel. She hesitated and Jake realized he had never seen Maria Santos hesitate at anything. The woman who had performed emergency surgery under mortar fire was struggling to get words out. He wasn't gone when I got there. He was barely holding on, but he was still conscious. He lived for another 4 minutes. The revelation hit Jake like a physical blow. What? He couldn't speak clearly, too much blood in his lungs. But he grabbed my arm and he tried to tell me something. It took me a while to understand, but eventually I made it out. Doc's dark eyes glistened in the early morning light. He said to tell you that it wasn't your fault, that he didn't die because of you. He died because he chose to. And if he had to make the same choice again, he would do exactly the same thing because you were worth saving. Jake found he couldn't breathe. Years of guilt, years of wondering why Daniel had sacrificed himself for a broken-down old sergeant who had nothing left to give the world, and the answer had been waiting all this time. Why didn't you tell me? The question came out ragged. Because you were in no state to hear it. You spent the next 6 months in military hospitals, then you disappeared into a bottle for 2 years after that. By the time you surfaced, I had convinced myself that telling you would only make things worse. That you would think I was just trying to make you feel better. Doc set her coffee cup down on the motorcycle's gas tank. I was wrong. I should have found you and made you listen. Maybe if I had, you wouldn't have spent nearly a decade running from yourself. He said I was worth saving. Those were his exact words. He also said to tell Ethan that his father loved him. Always. That was the last thing he said before he coded. Doc reached out and gripped Jake's shoulder with surprising strength. Daniel didn't die because you failed him, Titan. He died because he loved his family enough to want someone watching over them after he was gone. He chose you. Don't make his choice meaningless. Jake sat in the parking lot as the sun crept above the horizon, casting long shadows across the assembled motorcycles. Somewhere in the distance, a rooster crowed. The world was waking up, oblivious to the weight of revelation that had just settled onto his shoulders. Daniel had chosen him, not out of desperation or random chance, but deliberately. And for years, Jake had been spitting on that choice by hiding from the responsibility it entailed. Never again. The sun rose higher, burning away the morning mist, and Millbrook began to stir. Across town, in a Victorian mansion that dominated the wealthy end of Oak Street, Kyle Brennan sat in his father's study and felt the walls closing in. Judge Robert Brennan stood behind his mahogany desk, immaculate in a three-piece suit despite the early hour, his silver hair combed back with military precision. He was a handsome man in his late 50s, the kind of handsome that came from expensive grooming and absolute confidence in one's own importance. He had served on the county bench for 15 years, building a reputation for harsh sentences and judicial efficiency that had made him the darling of law and order voters throughout southeastern Ohio. He was also, Kyle had come to realize, completely incapable of love. "The press conference is at 2 o'clock, Robert said, sliding a sheet of paper across the desk. "This is your statement. Read it, memorize it, deliver it exactly as written. No improvisation, no emotional outbursts. Do you understand?" Kyle picked up the paper and scanned the words. They were perfectly crafted, each sentence designed to express remorse while subtly shifting blame. Phrases like "caught up in the moment" and "peer pressure" appeared multiple times. The statement acknowledged wrongdoing without actually accepting responsibility. It was Kyle recognized the work of an expensive public relations firm. "This isn't an apology," Kyle said. "This is damage control." "Of course it's damage control. Do you have any idea what your little stunt has done to this family's reputation? I've spent 30 years building my career, and you've managed to undermine it in 30 seconds of cell phone footage." Robert's voice never rose, never betrayed emotion. That was somehow worse than if he had shouted. "The statement is what it is. Your job is to deliver it convincingly." "What if I want to actually apologize? Like for real?" "Then you'll do it on your own time after the cameras are gone and the news cycle has moved on." Robert straightened a stack of papers that didn't need straightening. "Your genuine feelings are irrelevant to the current situation. What matters is controlling the narrative." Kyle stared at his father, really looked at him for perhaps the first time in years. He saw a man who had never hugged him, never told him he was proud, never expressed anything beyond cold satisfaction at achievements and colder disappointment at failures. He saw a man who had responded to his wife's death from cancer not with grief, but with irritation at the disruption to his schedule. "Is that what you told yourself when Mom died?" The words came out before Kyle could stop them. "That your genuine feelings were irrelevant." The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Robert's expression didn't change, but something shifted behind his eyes, something dangerous. "Your mother," he said slowly, "was weak. She coddled you, let you get away with things that never should have been tolerated. And this is the result." He gestured at the paper in Kyle's hand, what he calls hand. "A son who can't control his impulses. A son who has to be managed like a public relations crisis." "She loved me. She indulged you. There's a difference." Robert moved toward the door. "The car will be ready at 1:30. Wear the Navy suit. And for God's sake, look contrite." He left without waiting for a response, and Kyle sat alone in the study, surrounded by law books and framed photographs of his father, shaking hands with governors and senators. Not a single image of Kyle. Not a single image of his mother. The paper trembled in his hands. He could read the statement. Could stand in front of cameras and mouth words written by strangers. Could play the role of repentant teenager that his father had scripted for him. Or he could do something else entirely. His phone buzzed, a text from Marcus Webb, one of his teammates. "Yo, you seeing this? Like 100 bikers just rolled into town. It's insane." Kyle moved to the window and looked out at the street below. In the distance, he could see Main Street, and even from here, the gathering crowd was visible. People were coming out of their houses, lining the sidewalks, staring toward the eastern edge of town. The bikers were coming, and suddenly Kyle knew what he had to do. Saturday morning broke clear and cold over Millbrook, the kind of autumn day that made the dying leaves seem to glow from within. By 8 o'clock, news had spread through every corner of the small town. Strangers were coming, dozens of them, maybe hundreds. The rumors varied wildly depending on who was telling them. They're a gang coming to burn down the Brennan house. They're veterans here to honor Daniel Porter's memory. They're extremists looking for a fight. They're angels sent to stand with a suffering child. The truth, as usual, was more complicated and less dramatic than any of the rumors. 83 motorcycles had gathered at the motel parking lot. By 7:30, their riders representing every branch of the armed services and spanning conflicts from Vietnam to the ongoing operations in the Middle East. They wore leather and denim displayed patches identifying their club affiliations and their service records, and moved with the particular alertness of people who had trained to be aware of threats from any direction. Jake stood at the head of the assembly, Preacher on his right and Doc on his left. Behind them stretched the river of chrome and steel American flags fluttering from every vehicle, the black POW MIA banner appearing at regular intervals as a reminder that some sacrifices could never be repaid. "Everyone knows the plan," Jake said, his voice carrying across the parking lot. "We ride slow, we stay silent, we stop at Earl's Diner where Ethan was attacked, and we wait. No confrontation, no aggression. We're not here to fight anyone. We're here to stand with a 16-year-old kid who thinks he's alone in the world." "And if someone starts trouble?" asked a rider from the Cleveland chapter. "We don't respond, we turn the other cheek. We're better than that." Jake looked at the assembled faces, men and women who had seen combat, who had buried friends, who had every reason to want revenge on a world that had treated them as disposable. Daniel Porter didn't die so we could become bullies. He died protecting people. Today we honor that by protecting his son. Without violence, without intimidation, with presence alone. Preacher stepped forward, his white hair bright in the morning sun. "Let us bow our heads." 83 riders and their passengers fell silent. Even the wind seemed to still. Lord Day Preacher said, his chaplain's voice carrying the weight of countless battlefield prayers, "We ask your blessing on this ride. We ask that you guide our wheels and steady our hearts. We ask that you help us show this boy that he is loved, that he is seen, that he is not forgotten. And we ask that you bring peace to Daniel Porter's spirit, that he may know his son is watched over. Amen." "Amen," the assembly echoed. "Mount up." The sound of 83 engines starting simultaneously was not the aggressive roar of throttles being gunned. It was a low, steady rumble like distant thunder or the heartbeat of something enormous. The bikes pulled out of the parking lot in formation, Jake leading, and began their slow procession toward town. The people of Millbrook had been told to expect something frightening. The Facebook warnings had described an invasion, a gang assault, a riot in the making. Police had been positioned at key intersections. Shop owners had locked their doors. Parents had kept children inside. What they saw instead made them forget their fear. The motorcycles rolled down Main Street at barely 15 miles per hour, their engines purring rather than screaming. Every rider sat straight-backed, dignified, eyes forward. American flags streamed from every vehicle, their colors brilliant against the autumn sky. The black POW MIA banners appeared at regular intervals, solemn reminders of those who had never come home. At the front of the column, Jake rode past the boarded-up businesses, the vacant storefronts, the signs of a town that had been dying long before he arrived. But along the sidewalks, life was returning. People emerged from their houses, drawn by the low rumble and the spectacle of so much coordinated movement. They stood in silence, watching, uncertain how to respond. Then an old man in a faded army cap stepped off the curb and raised his hand in salute. Another veteran followed, then another. Up and down Main Street, men who had served in wars across 6 decades emerged from their homes and offered the only honor they knew how to give. The column reached Earl's Diner at 9:15, stopping in the parking lot where Ethan Porter had been tormented while the world watched and laughed. 83 engines cut off simultaneously, and the silence that followed was overwhelming. No one spoke. No one moved. 83 riders stood beside their bikes like a memorial made of flesh and steel, facing the direction of the Porter house 3 blocks away. Jake dismounted first. His boots crunched on the gravel as he walked to the front of the assembly. He didn't turn to face his fellow riders. He simply stood looking down the street toward where Ethan waited and let the silence speak for itself. On the diner's porch, a man in his 70s emerged from the door. Earl Patterson had served 2 tours in Vietnam before coming home to take over his father's restaurant. He had seen things in the Mekong Delta that still visited him in nightmares. And he had stood behind his counter 3 weeks ago, watching through the window as a deaf boy was humiliated in his parking lot and done nothing. Earl walked down the steps and approached Jake. His eyes were wet, his weathered hands trembling. "I was a coward," Earl said, his voice cracking. "That night, I saw everything, and I just stood there." Jake nodded slowly. "We've all been cowards at some point. What matters is what we do next. Tell me what I can do, anything. You've got a restaurant, you've got a community. Start there." Jake turned back toward the porterhouse. "For now, just stand with us." Earl took his place among the riders, one more figure in the growing tableau of solidarity. From her position on the porch of her home, Rachel Porter watched the street fill with strangers. Beside her, Ethan gripped the railing, his knuckles white, his eyes wide with something that might have been fear or wonder or both. The dog tags hung against his chest, catching the morning light. Rachel's hands moved, signing to her son. "They're here for you, all of them." Ethan signed back, his gestures rapid with emotion. "Why if I don't know any of them? Because your father knew one of them, and that was enough." The silence stretched on. 5 minutes. 10. The crowd that had gathered to watch began to realize they were witnessing something they couldn't quite name. Not a protest, not a celebration. Something deeper, something sacred. Jake began to walk. His boots measured out the distance between Earl's diner and the porterhouse, each step deliberate, unhurried. Behind him, the riders remained motionless. The crowd parted to let him pass. Children watched from windows. Old women crossed themselves. The whole town held its breath. He reached the porterhouse and stopped at the edge of the lawn. Ethan stood on the porch, frozen, the boy's gaze locked on the old soldier who had finally come to keep his promise. Jake didn't climb the steps. He simply knelt right there on the sidewalk, bringing his eyes level with the boy's. His knees screamed against the concrete. His back protested the position. He ignored everything except the face looking down at him. "Ethan." He spoke slowly, clearly, making sure the boy could read every word on his lips. "Your father was my brother, not by blood, but by something stronger. He saved my life, and his last thoughts were of you. He wanted you to know that you are loved, that you were always loved, and that you will never be alone again." Ethan's hands began to move, forming words that Jake couldn't understand. But Rachel was there, translating through her tears. "He says he forgives you for taking so long. He says his father wrote about you in letters, said you were stubborn, but that your heart was good. He says—" Rachel's voice broke. "He says he's glad you finally came home." Behind Jake, something was happening. From the crowd that had gathered to watch, people were stepping forward. One at a time, then in twos and threes, they moved from spectator to participant. Earl Patterson emerged from the diner with a handwritten sign, "Free coffee for veterans." Eleanor Finch, the retired sign language interpreter from the elementary school, raised her hands and began to sign toward Ethan. "We see you." A mother with a deaf son of her own moved to stand beside the porch, tears streaming down her face. A teenager who had been bullied for his stutter took his place among the growing crowd. They came from every corner of Millbrook, drawn by something they couldn't explain. People who had remained silent during Ethan's torment. People who had clicked past the video without comment. People who had told themselves it wasn't their problem, wasn't their responsibility, wasn't their fight. They came to stand with him now. Because sometimes courage is contagious. Because sometimes all it takes is one person kneeling on a sidewalk to remind everyone else what it means to be human. And then impossibly, Kyle Brennan appeared. He walked down the center of Main Street with the deliberate pace of someone approaching a firing squad. He wore jeans and a plain gray hoodie instead of the navy suit his father had prescribed. His face was pale, his hands visibly shaking, but his jaw was set with determination. The crowd murmured. Someone shouted an obscenity. A woman spat in his direction. Kyle kept walking. Jake rose from his knees, placing himself between the approaching boy and Ethan. His body tensed, ready for whatever was coming. "I need to talk to him," Kyle said, his voice barely audible. "Please, I need to say something." "You've said enough." Jake's tone carried the cold promise of violence. "Not the right things, not yet." Kyle's eyes were red-rimmed. I didn't come here because my father told me to. I came here despite what my father told me. I'm supposed to be at a press conference right now reading a statement that lawyers wrote pretending to be sorry while actually blaming everyone except myself. His voice cracked. But that's not an apology, and Ethan deserves a real one. Jake studied the boy's face, searching for deception. He saw fear, shame, and something that might have been the beginning of genuine remorse. If you do anything to hurt him more than you already have, I will end you. Understand? I understand. Jake stepped aside. Kyle approached the porch, slowly stopping at the bottom of the steps. He looked up at Ethan, who watched him with an expression of guarded wariness. I'm going to talk slowly, Kyle said, enunciating each word clearly. So you can read my lips. Is that okay? Ethan nodded almost imperceptibly. I did something terrible to you. I did it because I wanted to feel powerful, because at home I feel like nothing, because hurting someone else made me forget how much I hurt inside. Kyle's voice trembled. That's not an excuse. There is no excuse. I just want you to understand that it wasn't about you. It was never about you. You were just there, and I was too broken to see you as a person. The silence stretched on. Kyle continued. My mom died when I was 12. Cancer. After that, my dad just shut down. He doesn't know how to love anyone, and I grew up thinking that was normal. That controlling people, hurting people, that's just what power looks like. But the tears began to spill down Kyle's cheeks. I'm not asking you to forgive me. I don't deserve forgiveness. I just want you to know that I see you now. I see who you are, not what you can't do. And I'm sorry. I'm so sorry for everything. Ethan's hands moved. Rachel translated, her voice thick with emotion. He says he doesn't forgive you. Not yet. Maybe not ever. He says what you did hurt worse than anything that's happened since his father died, because at least his father's death had meaning. What you did was meaningless. Cruel for cruelty's sake. Kyle flinched as if struck. But, Rachel continued, he says he won't hate you. Hating someone is exhausting, and he's already tired enough. He says maybe someday, if you actually change, if you actually become a different person, he might be able to look at you without feeling sick. But that day isn't today. Kyle nodded, wiping his face with his sleeve. Thank you for even listening. I know you didn't have to. He turned to leave, but Ethan's hand shot out, catching Rachel's arm. He signed rapidly, urgently. Wait, Rachel called out. He wants to ask you something. Kyle stopped. Ethan signed and Rachel translated. Your father, does he make you try to be perfect? Does he make you feel like nothing you do is ever enough? Kyle's face crumpled. How did you know? Because he recognizes the look in your eyes, the look of someone trying to earn love from a person who doesn't know how to give it. The two boys stared at each other across the space of the porch steps, different in almost every way, joined by a grief they both understood. I hope you find peace, Ethan signed. I hope you escape. Kyle nodded, unable to speak, and walked away through the crowd. This time no one spat at him. No one cursed. They simply watched him go, uncertain what to feel about a villain who had revealed himself to be yet another broken child. Jake turned back to face the assembled crowd. Behind him, 83 bikers still stood beside their silent motorcycles. Before him, 200 citizens of Millbrook had gathered, drawn by forces they couldn't explain. Today, Jake said, his voice carrying across the hushed street, we came here to show one boy that he's not alone. But I think maybe we needed to show ourselves the same thing, all of us. Every person who stayed silent when we should have spoken up. Every person who looked away when we should have stood firm. Every person who convinced ourselves that someone else would handle it. He paused, letting the words settle. Daniel Porter was my briefing. He died saving my life. And his last wish was for someone to watch over his son. I've failed that wish for too many years. Years of cowardice. Years of excuses. But I'm done running. From today forward, Ethan Porter has 83 guardians who will ride through hell itself to stand beside him. And I hope after today he has a whole town full of neighbors who will do the same. From somewhere in the crowd, someone began to clap. Others joined. The applause swelled, not the frenzied cheering of a football game, but the solemn acknowledgement of something meaningful witnessed. Jake raised his hand and the clapping stopped. One more thing. He turned to face the assembled bikers. Brothers and sisters, let's show this boy how we say what words can't express. As 183 veterans raised their hands and formed the sign language symbol for I love you, thumb index finger and pinky extended, middle and ring finger folded down. They had learned it the night before practicing in motel rooms and parking lots until every rider could form the shape without hesitation. 83 hands held aloft in silence, speaking in Ethan's language. The boy stood on his porch staring at the forest of hands. His mother's arm was around his shoulders, her own hand forming the same shape. The crowd began to catch on people awkwardly attempting to mirror the gesture, getting it wrong, and trying again, determined to be part of the message. Ethan's hands rose slowly to his own chest. He signed something, and Rachel's voice carried it to the waiting crowd. He says thank you. He says this is the first time in his life he hasn't felt invisible. He says his father would be proud. Jake felt something shift inside him, some final piece of the broken machinery clicking back into place. Years of guilt, years of failure, years of running from a promise made in blood and dust. It was finished. Not perfectly, not completely, but finished enough. The riders held their formation for another long moment. Then at some unspoken signal, they began to lower their hands. Engines rumbled back to life. The column reformed, preparing to ride out of town. But they would be back. Every year on Veterans Day, Iron Brotherhood would return to Millbrook. They would ride down Main Street. They would stop at Earl's, a diner. They would stand in silence for a boy who had found his family among strangers. And Daniel Porden, wherever his spirit wandered, would finally be at peace. The aftermath arrived not with silence, but with noise, an avalanche of attention that swept through Millbrook like a flash flood through a dry riverbed. Within 48 hours of the ride, camera crews from 4 different networks had descended on the small Ohio town, their satellite trucks lining Main Street like an occupying army. Reporters knocked on doors at all hours, seeking interviews, reactions, anything that could be packaged into a 3-minute segment for the evening broadcast. The story had escaped the boundaries of regional interest and exploded into national consciousness. NBC ran at first a 6-minute piece on the evening news that featured drone footage of the motorcycle procession intercut with clips from the original Bullying video. The anchor's voice carried the practiced gravity of someone delivering news about natural disasters or political scandals. 40 bikers turned cruelty into courage today in a small Ohio town, reminding us all what it means to stand with those who cannot stand alone. CBS followed with their own version, emphasizing the military angle, interviewing veterans who had participated in the ride. Grizzly appeared on screen, his massive frame barely contained by the interview chair, speaking haltingly about his son Kevin and the old man at the funeral who had taught him that grief shared is grief halved. CNN dedicated an entire hour to the story, bringing in experts on bullying, disability advocates, and a psychologist who spoke about the lasting trauma of public humiliation. They played the moment when 83 hands rose in the sign language symbol for love, and the anchor's voice cracked slightly as she described what viewers were witnessing. The hashtag Ride for Respect trended for 7 consecutive days. The original Bullying video, which had accumulated 200,000 views before the ride, was pulled from every platform as users reported it en masse. In its place, videos of the motorcycle procession multiplied like cells, dividing each new upload, garnering millions of views. Letters began arriving at the Porter house by the bagful. The postal carrier, a woman named Denise, who had delivered mail on this route for 22 years, started making special trips just to handle the volume. Envelopes came from every state in the Union, from veterans and civilians, from parents of deaf children, and people who had been bullied themselves. Many contained money small bills, mostly 5s and 10s and 20s, folded into handwritten notes. For Ethan, with gratitude and hope, from one survivor to another. Your father would be so proud. Rachel sat on her living room floor one evening, surrounded by open envelopes, and wept. Not from sadness, but from the overwhelming evidence that the world contained more kindness than cruelty, if only people could find the courage to express it. She had spent years believing she and Ethan were alone, that the universe had dealt them a losing hand and expected them to play it without complaint. Now strangers from across the country were proving her wrong. The donations eventually totaled over $300,000, far more than Rachel could have earned in years of nursing shifts. She established a trust fund for Ethan's education and donated the remainder to organizations supporting deaf children and military families. It felt right somehow to transform their pain into possibility for others. But the attention brought complications as well as blessings. Judge Robert Brennan had not accepted his public humiliation gracefully. In the days following the ride, he made phone calls to every political contact he had cultivated over 3 decades, seeking support for legal action against Iron Brotherhood, against the Porter family, against anyone whose name he could attach to his perceived persecution. The calls went unanswered. Former allies suddenly found themselves too busy to speak with him. Invitations to golf outings and charity dinners stopped arriving. The judicial appointment to the state appellate court that he had been quietly pursuing evaporated without explanation. Robert Brennan had spent his career building power through fear and obligation, and now that structure was collapsing around him as people recognized that association with his name had become a liability rather than an asset. He resigned from the bench 6 weeks after the ride, citing health concerns that no one believed. The family mansion went on the market shortly thereafter. By Christmas, Robert Brennan had relocated to a condominium in Florida far from the town that had witnessed his disgrace. The death threats that had plagued Rachel's phone in the weeks following the viral video ceased entirely within days of the ride. State police investigators traced several of the most violent messages to anonymous accounts linked to members of Robert Brennan's professional circle, though insufficient evidence prevented formal charges. The pattern was unmistakable. The harassment had been coordinated perhaps not by Brennan directly, but by those who sought his favor. With his fall from grace, the campaign of intimidation evaporated like morning frost under harsh sunlight. Rachel deleted the threatening messages without reading them again, a small act of closure that felt larger than it should have. His son did not accompany him to Florida. Kyle Brennan had made his choice on the day of the ride, standing before Ethan Porter and speaking words his father would never have approved. That choice had consequences. Robert cut him off financially, refused his phone calls, instructed family attorneys to remove Kyle from any inheritance documents. The message was clear: conform or be cast out. Kyle chose exile. He moved in with his maternal grandmother, Eleanor Brennan, a woman in her late 70s who lived in a modest house on the outskirts of Cincinnati. Eleanor had never approved of her daughter Linda's marriage to Robert, had watched with growing horror as her grandson transformed into a smaller version of his cold and controlling father. When Kyle appeared on her doorstep with a duffel bag and tears in his eyes, she opened her door without hesitation. The first night they sat together in her small kitchen while Kyle poured out the story of his life. The pressure to be perfect, the absence of affection, the way his father had responded to Linda's death, not with grief, but with irritation at the inconvenience. Eleanor listened without interruption, her weathered hands wrapped around a cup of tea that grew cold as the hours passed. When Kyle finally fell silent, Eleanor spoke the words that would change everything. "Your mother didn't just leave letters for you, Kyle. She left one for me too, and there's something in it you need to know." She rose from the table and retrieved a wooden box from her bedroom closet. Inside, among photographs and dried flowers and the accumulated treasures of a long life, lay a sealed envelope addressed in Linda Brennan's handwriting. "She gave this to me 6 months before she died, made me promise not to open it until the time was right." Eleanor placed the envelope in Kyle's trembling hands. "I think the time is right." Kyle broke the seal with shaking fingers. The letter inside was 3 pages long, written in his mother's careful script, and it destroyed everything he thought he knew about his family. "My dearest Kyle, if you're reading this, something has happened to bring you to your grandmother's house away from your father. I always hoped this day would come, though I prayed it would happen differently. There are things I need to tell you, things I should have said while I was alive but couldn't because I was afraid of what your father might do. I didn't stop loving you when I got sick. I stopped being able to protect you. And watching Robert shape you into a copy of himself was the worst part of dying. Worse than the pain, worse than the fear, knowing I was leaving you with a man who would never teach you how to love, only how to control. Your grandmother knows how to reach me. Not me exactly, but the part of me that lives on. Go to her. Let her show you. And know that wherever I am, whatever comes after this life, I have never stopped loving you. Always, Mom." Kyle read the letter 3 times, certain he was misunderstanding something. The part of me that lives on. What did that mean? Eleanor was watching him with an expression of mingled hope and apprehension. "There's more, Kyle. Something I've kept secret for 5 years." "What secret?" "Your mother recorded videos. Dozens of them. messages for you for different moments in your life. She made them during her last months when she knew she wasn't going to survive. She gave them to me with instructions to share them when you were ready. Eleanor's eyes glistened. I think you're ready now. They watched the first video together that night, huddled around Eleanor's ancient laptop. Linda Brennan appeared on screen, thinner than Kyle remembered, her hair gone from chemotherapy, but her eyes still bright with the fierce love that had been the only warmth in his childhood. Hey, sweetheart, if you're watching this, it means you found your way to Grandma's house. I'm so proud of you. I know it must have taken courage to leave your father. I wish I had been brave enough to do the same thing. Kyle wept as his mother spoke to him across the years. She told him about her own struggles with Robert's coldness, her failed attempts to soften his harshness, her guilt at leaving Kyle in his care. She told him about her hopes for his future, hopes that had nothing to do with football, scholarships, or judicial appointments. She wanted him to find someone to love, to build a family based on warmth instead of control, to break the cycle of emotional absence that had poisoned 3 generations of Brennan men. You are not your father, Linda said at the end of the video, her voice steady despite the tears tracking down her hollow cheeks. You never have to be your father. You get to choose who you become. And whatever you choose, I will love you. Always. That's what mothers do. The screen went dark. Kyle sat in silence, the laptop's glow reflecting off the tears that wouldn't stop falling. There are 37 more videos, Eleanor said softly. One for your 18th birthday, one for graduation, one for your wedding day whenever that comes. She thought of everything. Kyle closed the laptop and turned to his grandmother. I want to watch them all, but first I need to do something. What's that? I need to write a letter to Ethan Porter. He wrote it that night, sitting at Eleanor's kitchen table with a cup of cold coffee and a pen that kept running dry. The letter took 4 attempts before he got it right. No excuses, no explanations, just acknowledgement of the pain he had caused and a promise to spend the rest of his life trying to become someone his mother would have been proud of. He signed it without including a return address. He wasn't seeking absolution or even response. He just needed Ethan to know that the boy who had tormented him was trying to change. The letter arrived at the Porter house 3 weeks after the ride. Rachel considered throwing it away unopened, but something made her hand it to Ethan instead. She watched her son read it, watched the emotions play across his face, watched him fold the paper carefully and place it in the wooden box where he kept his father's letters from Afghanistan. He didn't respond, but he didn't throw it away either. And somehow that felt like progress. The therapy office occupied a converted Victorian house on Pittsburgh's north side, its waiting room decorated with soothing watercolors and magazines nobody ever read. Jake Harrison had been coming here every Thursday for 6 weeks now, a commitment that would have seemed impossible a year ago. He had spent decades avoiding conversations about his feelings, convinced that acknowledging weakness was the same as succumbing to it. Patricia Okonkwo had dismantled that conviction with patient persistence. She was a woman in her early 60s, Nigerian by birth, American by choice with a specialty in trauma among combat veterans. She had heard every excuse for avoidance that Jake could manufacture and had gently demolished each one. Tell me about the nightmares, she said during their 7th session. Have they changed since Millbrook? Jake considered the question. For years, his sleep had been haunted by a recurring dream, Daniel dying in his arms while Jake failed to save him, the same scene playing on endless loop with minor variations. Sometimes the setting changed. Sometimes the dialogue shifted. But the ending was always the same. Daniel died and Jake woke up drenched in sweat, convinced that he had failed again. They're different now, he admitted. Daniel's still there, but he's not dying. He's just talking to me, telling me about Ethan, asking me to watch over him. And how do you feel when you wake up from these dreams? Sad, but not guilty anymore. Like I'm finally doing what he asked. Dr. Okonkwo made a note in her leather-bound journal. That's significant progress, Jake. Guilt kept you trapped in a cycle of self-punishment for the better part of a decade. It prevented you from keeping your promise because some part of you believed you didn't deserve to keep it, that you didn't deserve to be the one who survived. Maybe I didn't. Daniel didn't think so. He gave his life to save yours because he believed you were worth saving. He entrusted his son to you because he believed you would protect him. Those weren't the actions of a man who thought his sacrifice was wasted. She leaned forward slightly. The question isn't whether you deserve to survive. The question is what you're going to do with the life Daniel gave you. Jake sat with those words for a long moment. I'm going back to Millbrook this weekend. Ethan and I are going fishing. How does that feel? Terrifying. I don't know anything about being a father figure. I don't know anything about raising a teenage boy, especially one who can't hear. I'm probably going to screw it up 100 different ways. And yet you're going anyway. Yeah, because showing up is the only thing I know how to do. Even when I'm scared, maybe especially when I'm scared. Dr. Okonkwo smiled the first time Jake had seen that expression on her professional face. That's what courage looks like, Jake. Not the absence of fear, but the willingness to act despite it. Daniel saw that in you. Now you're starting to see it in yourself. The fishing trip happened on a cold Saturday in early December, 2 months after the ride. Jake arrived at the Porter house before dawn, his truck loaded with rods and tackle and a cooler full of sandwiches. Ethan was waiting on the porch bundled in a winter coat that had belonged to his father. They drove to a lake 30 miles outside town, a spot Jake had discovered years ago during one of his periods of isolation. The water was glass smooth in the early morning, light mist rising from its surface like ghosts reluctant to depart. They set up on a wooden dock that extended 20 feet into the shallows, their breath visible in the frigid air. Jake had learned enough sign language over the past 2 months to communicate basic concepts, though his fingers still stumbled over complex phrases. He showed Ethan how to bait a hook, how to cast without tangling the line, how to feel for the subtle tug that indicated a bite. The boy learned quickly, his hands adapting to the motions with the same facility they showed for drawing. They caught nothing for the first 2 hours. But that wasn't really the point. Sitting beside each other on the weathered dock, watching their lines drift in the gentle current, Jake found himself thinking about all the moments Daniel had missed. First days of school, birthday parties, the gradual transformation from child to adolescent. Ethan had experienced all of it without a father, guided only by a mother who was herself struggling to survive. Jake couldn't replace what had been lost. He knew that. But maybe he could offer something else. Not a substitute for Daniel, but a supplement, a steady presence. A role model, however imperfect. Someone to teach Ethan the things that men were supposed to teach boys in the absence of fathers. Around 10 o'clock, Ethan's line suddenly went taut. The boy's eyes widened as the rod bent under unexpected weight. Jake was beside him instantly, guiding his hands, showing him how to set the hook and begin the slow process of reeling in. The fish fought for several minutes before surrendering a largemouth bass that would have been impressive in any season. Ethan hauled it onto the dock with an expression of pure triumph, the first genuine joy Jake had seen on the boy's face since they met. They photographed the catch before releasing it back into the lake. Ethan insisted on signing "thank you" to the fish before it disappeared into the dark water, a gesture that made Jake smile despite his usual emotional reserve. On the drive home, Ethan typed a message on his phone and showed it to Jake at a red light. "Can we do this again next month?" Jake typed back, "Every month, as long as you want." Ethan nodded, then added another message. "My dad would have liked you, even if you're terrible at fishing." Jake laughed, the sound surprising him with its unfamiliarity. He couldn't remember the last time he had laughed at anything. "Your dad already liked me," he signed clumsily. "He told me so, right before he saved my life." Ethan's response was immediate. Then maybe he knew something we're just figuring out. Rachel Porter had not been on a date in 9 years. The last time had been with Daniel, a fancy restaurant in Columbus, where he had surprised her with tickets to a concert she had been wanting to attend. She still remembered the way he had held her hand across the table, the asymmetric smile that appeared whenever he was planning something romantic. After his death, she had closed that part of herself off completely. Survival required focus, and focus required the elimination of distractions. Dating seemed frivolous, selfish, a betrayal of the man who had given everything for his country and his family. She buried herself in work and parenting, telling herself that someday when Ethan was grown, she might consider opening her heart again. The sign language classes at Earl's Diner changed something. The program had started small, a dozen people meeting on Thursday evenings to learn the basics of ASL from a certified instructor Rachel had helped recruit. But word spread quickly, and within 2 months, the class had grown to 40 regular attendees. Earl had to knock down a wall to create enough space, converting his storage room into an improvised classroom. Among the students was a man named Thomas Whitfield, 47 years old, divorced, a high school history teacher who had joined the class because one of his students was deaf and he wanted to be able to communicate with her directly. He was quiet, thoughtful, with a dry sense of humor that emerged gradually as Rachel got to know him. He wasn't trying to impress anyone. He just wanted to be a better teacher. Their first conversation happened after class one evening, both of them lingering to practice signs with the instructor. Thomas asked her about Ethan, about Daniel, about the weight of raising a deaf child alone. His questions came without judgment or pity, just genuine curiosity about her experience. She found herself talking more than she had talked to anyone in years. Thomas listened the way few people knew how to listen anymore, with full attention, responding only when he had something meaningful to add. By the time they realized the diner had emptied around them, 3 hours had passed. He asked if he could buy her coffee sometime. Not a date, he clarified, just two people continuing a conversation they had started. Rachel almost said no out of reflex, but something in his earnest brown eyes reminded her that she was allowed to want things for herself. That survival didn't have to mean solitude. She said yes. The coffee became dinner. Dinner became walks along the river that wound through Millbrook's modest park system. Thomas met Ethan and communicated with him using the halting sign language he was still mastering. Ethan seemed cautiously curious about this stranger who was spending time with his mother, neither welcoming nor hostile, simply observing. 4 months after the ride, Rachel allowed herself to consider a future that included something other than work and worry. Thomas understood that she would always love Daniel, that a part of her heart would remain forever claimed by the man who had died in Afghanistan. He didn't try to replace that love. He simply offered to stand beside it, an addition rather than a substitution. Daniel would want you to be happy, Jake told her during one of his monthly visits. He talked about you constantly over there. Said you deserved better than a soldier who was never home. He would be glad you found someone. Rachel wasn't sure she believed in messages from the dead, but she believed in Jake's sincerity, in the honesty of a man who had spent years atoning for perceived failures. If Jake thought Daniel would approve, that counted for something. The first anniversary of the ride arrived on a Veterans Day that dawned gray and cold. Low clouds threatening snow that wouldn't fall until evening. By 9 o'clock, more than 200 motorcycles had gathered in the parking lot that had once held only 43. The word had spread throughout the veteran community, Millbrook, Ohio, on November 11th. Come stand with us. They came from every state east of the Mississippi and several beyond. They came in cars and trucks, when their bikes wouldn't start in the cold. They came wearing leather and denim military insignia and American flags, the accumulated symbols of service and sacrifice. Jake stood at the head of the assembly, feeling the weight of all those eyes upon him. A year ago, he had been a broken man running from his past. Now he was something else, something he still didn't have a name for. A leader, perhaps. A symbol, or maybe just a man who had finally stopped making excuses. Preacher stood beside him, white hair flowing beneath his helmet, pale eyes bright with purpose. Doc and Grizzly flanked the old chaplain, their faces set with the determined expressions of people who understood what this day meant. Ghost had arrived at dawn, and appearing from wherever he had spent the night, his presence a reminder that some wounds never fully heal, but can still be carried forward. The ride proceeded much as it had a year before, though the route had been extended to pass by the new Veterans Memorial that Millbrook had constructed in the town square. A bronze statue stood at its center, now depicting a soldier kneeling to embrace a child. The plaque at its base read, "In honor of SFC Daniel Porter and all who gave their lives so others might live." The motorcycles rumbled past the memorial in silence, each rider offering some form of salute. Then they continued to Earl's Diner, where Ethan waited on the porch with his mother and Thomas and a crowd of townspeople who had gathered to witness the annual observance. This time Jake did not kneel. He climbed the porch steps and stood face to face with the boy who had become, in some profound sense, his son. "Hey, kid." His signing had improved dramatically over the past year, countless hours of practice finally bearing fruit. "Ready?" Ethan nodded. He was holding a sheaf of papers, a speech he had written and rewritten over the past month. Today, for the first time, he was going to address the crowd in his own voice. They had discussed this possibility for weeks. Ethan had learned to speak as a child before anyone realized that speech therapy couldn't replace the hearing he had never possessed. His voice was unusual. The consonants slightly blurred the rhythm, different from hearing speakers. He had been self-conscious about it for years, preferring to on rather than subject himself to the curious stares that always followed when he spoke aloud. But today was different. Today he wanted them to hear him. A microphone had been set up on the porch connected to speakers that would carry his words across the assembled crowd. Ethan approached it slowly, the papers trembling slightly in his hands. 200 riders stood in silence, their engines cold, their attention absolute. "My name is Ethan Porter." The words came out clear and strong, surprising him with their steadiness. "I can't hear my own voice right now. I can't hear your reactions. I can't hear the wind or the birds or the motorcycles that brought you here. I've never heard any of those things. I never will." He paused, gathering himself for the next part. "A year ago, some people thought that made me less than them. They thought because I couldn't hear, I couldn't feel. They thought because I couldn't call for help, I didn't deserve it. They filmed themselves hurting me and shared it with the world, expecting everyone to laugh." Another pause. The crowd remained utterly silent. "But you didn't laugh. You came. 200 of you this year, 83 last year, and I don't know how many next year. You came because my father saved one of your brothers. You came because you understand what it means to stand with people who are suffering. You came because you believe that everyone deserves to be seen." Ethan looked up from his papers, his gaze sweeping across the sea of leather and chrome. "I used to think silence was my enemy. I used to hate the quiet inside my head, the isolation it created. But this past year, I've learned something different. Silence isn't emptiness. Silence is a language. It's the language of presence, of standing beside someone without needing words, of showing up when showing up is all you can do." His hands moved involuntarily into sign language as he spoke, reinforcing his words with gesture. "My father died when I was 8 years old. I have very few memories of him. I never heard his voice. I don't know what his laugh sounded like, or how he said my name, or what songs he sang when he thought no one was listening. For a long time, that loss felt unbearable, like there was a hole in me that nothing could fill. Tears were flowing now down his cheeks, and Rachel's and Jake's, and dozens of others throughout the crowd. But then you came, all of you, and you showed me that family isn't just about blood. It's about choice. It's about showing up. It's about standing in silence with someone because words aren't enough and silence is all you have to give." He looked directly at Jake. "A year ago, a man kept a promise he had made to my father. A promise that took him too long to honor. And I'm so grateful he finally did." Jake's throat tightened around emotions he hadn't known he could still feel. "To everyone here today, thank you. Thank you for seeing me. Thank you for standing with me. Thank you for teaching me that I'm not alone, that I was never alone, that I will never be alone, as long as people like you exist in the world." Ethan folded his papers and raised his hand, forming the sign for "I love you." 200 hands rose in response, mirroring the gesture. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of everything that words could never express. The cemetery lay on a hill at the edge of town, its older sections marked by weathered stones dating back to the 1800s, its newer sections still raw with recently turned earth. Daniel Porter's grave occupied a spot near the eastern fence where morning sun would be the first to reach it. Jake and Ethan stood before the headstone as the afternoon light began to fade. The crowds had dispersed, the motorcycles had rumbled away to their various homes, and Millbrook had returned to its usual quiet. But these two remained, paying private respects that no audience needed to witness. "I come here every week," Ethan signed. "I tell him about school, about Mom, about you." Jake nodded. "What do you tell him about me? That you're stubborn, that you're terrible at fishing, that you keep your promises even when it takes a while." A small smile crossed the boy's face. "That I'm glad he trusted you." Jake knelt beside the grave, his knees protesting the cold ground. He traced the engraved letters with his fingers. Porter, Daniel J. The same letters that had been stamped into the dog tags Ethan now wore around his neck at all times. "Hey, Danny." His voice was quiet, intended only for the man who might or might not be listening from somewhere beyond. "I finally did it. Took me longer than it should have, but I kept my word. The kid's going to be okay. Rachel too. They've got a whole town looking out for them now, plus 83 bikers who'll ride through hell if anyone ever hurts them again. Ethan watched Jake's lips move, understanding some of the words, inferring others from context and expression. I'm learning sign language, Jake continued. Pretty good at it now, actually. Danny would laugh at that. He always said I was too old to learn new tricks. But I guess you can teach an old soldier a few things if you try hard enough. The wind picked up, rustling the dead leaves that had collected around the base of the headstone. Jake chose to interpret it as acknowledgement. I miss you, brother. Every day. But I'm not drowning in guilt anymore. Doc told me what you said before you died about how you chose to save me, how you'd make the same choice again. I believe her, and I'm trying to live up to that choice, trying to be the man you thought I was. He rose slowly, his joints stiff from the cold, and placed his hand on Ethan's shoulder. Your dad was the best man I ever knew, he signed, and you're going to be just like him. Already are in the ways that matter. Ethan looked at the headstone, at the name of the father he had barely known, at the evidence of a life cut short by war. Then he signed something that made Jake's breath catch in his throat. He's not gone. He's in you. He's in me. He's in everyone who came today. As long as we remember him, as long as we keep his promises, he's still here. Jake pulled the boy into an embrace, the kind of fierce, uncomplicated hug that men rarely allowed themselves. They stood that way for a long moment, two people bound by loss and love and the unexpected grace of second chances. Come on, Jake's son, when they finally separated. Rachel's making dinner, and I promised to teach you how to change your own oil this weekend. Your dad would have wanted you to know that. They walked away from the grave together, leaving Daniel Porter in the fading light. But they carried him with them too, in memory and promise, and the unbreakable bonds of chosen family. 1 year after the ride, the transformations were visible everywhere. Millbrook had reversed its decline for the first time in 2 decades. The attention from the national media had attracted tourists, mostly veterans and their families, who wanted to see the town that had become famous for standing with a bullied child. Earl's Diner expanded twice. New businesses opened on Main Street. Young families began moving in, drawn by the sense of community that had emerged from crisis. Earl Patterson had kept every promise he made on the day of the ride and then exceeded them. His restaurant now offered free meals to any veteran who asked, funded by donations from customers who wanted to pay it forward. A wall near the entrance displayed photographs of local veterans alongside their service records, a growing memorial that Earl tended with the same care he had once devoted to maintaining his rifle in the Mekong Delta. The sign language classes continued every Thursday evening, taught by certified instructors open to anyone who wanted to learn. What had started with a dozen curious residents had grown into a community institution, with over 200 people now possessing at least basic ASL proficiency. Earl himself had become surprisingly fluent, his thick fingers forming signs with unexpected grace as he took orders from deaf customers who now traveled from neighboring counties just to experience a restaurant where they could communicate without barriers. A bronze plaque had been installed beside the diner's front door, funded by anonymous donation. In this place, a community learned that silence is not emptiness, but a language waiting to be spoken. In memory of SFC Daniel Porter, who taught us that love requires no sound. Jake Harrison had moved to Ohio, taking an apartment in Columbus that put him within an hour's drive of Millbrook. He worked part-time at a motorcycle shop, using skills he had developed over decades of maintaining his own bikes. The rest of his time, he devoted to the Daniel Porter Memorial Fund, which had grown into a national organization supporting deaf children in military families. The nightmares had not stopped entirely, but they had changed. Daniel appeared in them still, but as a companion rather than a casualty. They would sit together in dreamscapes that bore no resemblance to Afghanistan, talking about Ethan, about Rachel, about the small victories and ongoing struggles of the family Daniel had left behind. Grizzly had finally visited his son's grave at Arlington. He went alone the first time, standing before Kevin's headstone for 3 hours without speaking. The second time he brought flowers. The third time he brought Jake, and they stood together in silent solidarity while Grizzly wept for the first time in 17 years. Ghost remained Ghost, sleeping under stars and struggling with demons that no amount of brotherhood could fully exorcise. The nightmares still came. The faces of men he had killed through rifle scopes still visited him in the dark hours before dawn. But something had shifted in him since Millbrook, some small crack in the armor of isolation he had worn for decades. He had begun speaking more frequently at club meetings, sharing fragments of Navajo wisdom that the other members had learned to treasure. He had even allowed Doc to treat a persistent cough that had plagued him for months, the first time in years he had accepted medical care from anyone. When she asked why he had finally relented, he simply said that dying alone in the woods no longer seemed like an acceptable ending to his story. He came to Millbrook more often now, appearing without warning, staying for a few days before vanishing again into whatever wilderness called to him. Sometimes Jake would find him sitting on the porter's back porch at dawn, watching the sun rise with Ethan beside him, the two of them communicating in a language that required no words and no signs, just shared presence. Ethan had formed an unlikely bond with the quiet Navajo, two people who understood what it meant to experience the world differently than everyone else. Ghost had begun teaching the most traditional Navajo art, the intricate patterns and symbols that his grandmother had passed down to him before the war had burned away so much of who he was. In return, Ethan taught Ghost the basics of sign language, and something almost like peace would settle over the old sniper's weathered features as his scarred hands learned to form words without sound. Preacher had presided over 14 funerals for Iron Brotherhood members over the past year, each one a reminder that they were all running out of time. But he had also presided over 3 weddings and 2 christenings, evidence that life continued even as death claimed its due. He would turn 78 in spring, and he had already informed the club that he expected a ride out like nothing they had ever seen. Kyle Brennan had graduated from high school in Cincinnati and enrolled at Ohio State studying social work with a concentration in child welfare. He volunteered at a center for deaf children on weekends learning sign language with the same determination he had once applied to football. He still wrote to Ethan occasionally, letters that never expected response, but offered updates on his progress toward becoming someone his mother would have been proud of. Ethan had been accepted to the Rhode Island School of Design with a full scholarship based on his portfolio, which included the painting of the motorcycle ride that now hung in the National Veterans Museum in Washington. He would leave for college in the fall, the first porter to pursue education beyond high school, carrying with him his father's dog tags and the knowledge that an entire community would be watching over him from afar. Rachel had said yes to Thomas's proposal on a quiet evening in March, accepting a modest ring that suited her practical nature. The wedding was scheduled for June, a small ceremony at the Millbrook Community Church with Jake serving as a witness and Ethan giving his mother away. And every November on Veterans Day, the motorcycles returned to Millbrook. The numbers grew each year, 200, becoming 300, becoming 500 riders, coming from across the country to honor a promise and remember a man. They rode down Main Street in silence, stopped at Earl's Diner, raised their hands in the sign for love, and reminded the world that showing up matters, that standing with people matters, that keeping promises matters even when it takes years to find the courage. On the evening of the second annual ride, Jake sat alone on the porch of the house he had helped Rachel and Thomas renovate, watching the stars emerge over Millbrook. The town had changed around him, grown and healed, and become something worth believing in. He had changed too, though the transformation had been harder to recognize until he saw it reflected in the eyes of others. 63 years old now, more years behind him than ahead. But for the first time since Kandahar, that arithmetic didn't feel like a burden. It felt like permission. Permission to stop running. Permission to build instead of destroy. Permission to love people without waiting for them to be taken away. Daniel Porter had given him that permission with his last breath, had trusted him enough to make him responsible for the most precious things in his life. It had taken years for Jake to accept the gift, but now that he had, he intended to honor it for whatever time remained. The screen door creaked behind him. Ethan emerged onto the porch, 2 bottles of root beer in his hands, and settled into the chair beside Jake. They sat together in comfortable silence, watching the darkness deepen, 2 people who had found each other across impossible distances. After a while, Ethan's hands moved in the dim light, forming words that Jake had learned to read as easily as a spoken language. "Thank you for coming back." Jake's response was immediate, his signing fluid with practice. "Thank you for letting me." They clinked their bottles together, a toast to absent friends and present family, and watched the stars wheel slowly overhead. Somewhere out there, Jake chose to believe Daniel Porter was watching too. And finally, after years of wandering, his spirit had found peace. The promise had been kept, the weight had been lifted, and in a small town in Ohio, on a porch overlooking a street that had learned what